It's been years since my father disappeared. I remember the day he left for what was supposed to be a simple business trip and never returned. There were no goodbyes or explanations, just a void that consumed our home. The police investigated for months, but without any concrete leads, the case was closed. My mother tried to move on, but his absence slowly devoured us. His silence was deafening, a sort of dark presence that lingered in the hallways of our house. It's strange to say, but over time, we began to accept the idea that he would never come back. It was less painful than living in hope. The notion that he might be dead was easier to digest than believing he had left us for no reason. And then one day, he simply appeared. I was in the living room, distracted, when I heard the front door creak open. It was a common sound in our old house, but that particular creak sent chills down my spine. I got up, expecting to see my mother or someone I knew, but instead, there he was, standing in the doorway as if he had never left. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, looking into the house. I remember being in shock for a few seconds before I managed to speak. "Dad?" He smiled, or at least tried to. The movement seemed uncomfortable on his face, as if he had forgotten how to do it. But yes, it was him. Physically, he hadn't changed much. The same brown eyes, the same gray hair at the temples, but there was something wrong. It was a feeling hard to describe, as if he no longer belonged in that place. There was a distance in him, something that wasn't there before. My mother was overjoyed when she saw him. She cried, hugged him, and kept repeating how much she missed him. He embraced her back, albeit hesitantly, as if he didn't quite know how to react. I couldn't move. I just watched. Something wasn't right. I knew that, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Maybe it was the way he looked at us, as if we were behind an invisible barrier, unreachable to him. The first few days after his return were a blur of emotions. My mother insisted that everything go back to normal, as if he had never disappeared. But I couldn't shake that feeling of discomfort. My father was there, in flesh and blood, but at the same time, he wasn't. He moved through the house like a stranger, as if he were adjusting to an unfamiliar environment. His steps were careful, almost calculated, as if he were walking on unstable ground. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of a sentence, as if he had forgotten what he was saying, or as if he were listening to something we couldn't hear. At first, I tried to ignore these things. I told myself he needed time to adjust, that his disappearance must have been traumatic, that there was a logical explanation for his behavior. But the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. He avoided talking about the time he had been gone. When someone asked, he gave vague answers, avoided eye contact, and quickly changed the subject. The look in his eyes was always distant, as if he were watching something behind us, something only he could see. One night, I heard noises coming from the hallway. They were light, hesitant footsteps. I got out of bed and went to the door. In the dimly lit corridor, I saw my father standing by the window. He had his back to me, staring out into the darkness. "Dad?" I called, my voice sounding weaker than I expected. He didn't respond or turn around. He just stood there, motionless. As I got closer, I noticed he was murmuring something. Words I couldn't understand. Quick, nervous whispers. I touched his shoulder, and he jumped as if pulled from a trance. "Are you okay?" I asked. He smiled again, that same forced smile, and told me not to worry. He went back to the bedroom without saying anything else, leaving me alone in the hallway with a growing sense that something was very wrong. The next day, I tried to ask what he had been doing the night before, but he acted as if he didn't remember anything. In the days that followed, I started to notice other things. He began to avoid mirrors. It wasn't something he did overtly, but just enough for me to notice. When he passed by a mirror, he would quickly look away, almost as if he were afraid of his own reflection. And then, there were the dreams. I started dreaming about him, but these dreams were different, more vivid than anything I had ever experienced. In the dreams, he was always standing somewhere dark, looking at me with those distant eyes. He would whisper things I couldn't understand, but the sounds filled me with dread. I would wake up sweating, with the feeling that something was wrong. I told my mother about the dreams, but she said it was normal. "He just came back," she said. "It'll take time for us to adjust." But it wasn't that. Something was wrong, very wrong, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Our neighbors, old family friends, also started commenting. "He seems different," they said. "Colder, more distant." I could only agree. There was a change in him, something deep and disturbing, but no one could put their finger on exactly what it was. Then, one night, I woke up from one of those terrible dreams and heard the noises again. This time, they were louder, clearer. I went downstairs and found him in the kitchen, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the ceiling. The light from the open refrigerator illuminated his face in a ghostly way, and he was whispering again, this time a little louder. I stopped at the kitchen entrance, unable to move. I could hear his words now, and they were incomprehensible. Not a language I recognized, but distorted sounds, almost like a chant. When he noticed my presence, he stopped abruptly, closed the refrigerator, and walked out of the kitchen without saying a word. At that moment, something inside me broke. I knew that the man who looked like my father was not truly him. Something had returned in his place, something that didn't belong to this world. I wanted to confront him, demand answers, but fear consumed me. I started sleeping with the door locked and avoided being alone with him for long periods. Every time he entered the room, I felt an oppressive, almost suffocating presence. It was as if the house itself rejected his presence, as if he were bringing something terrible with him. Weeks went by, and I continued to watch him. He started spending more time outside, without saying where he was going. Some nights, he didn't come back, and when questioned, he gave those same, evasive answers. The tension between us was growing, but no one in the family seemed willing to acknowledge it. I felt like I was losing my mind, but at the same time, I knew I was closer to the truth than ever. I just needed to uncover what was really happening. I just needed one more piece of evidence, something concrete, something I could show. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at home became even more unbearable. It was as if something invisible had infiltrated every corner, every object, every breath. It wasn't just my father's behavior that bothered me, but the very sensation of being home. The place that once was my refuge now felt like it was closing in on me. The walls drawing closer, as if they were trying to swallow me whole. The light seemed dimmer, the shadows longer. I spent hours watching my father, waiting for something, anything, that could confirm what I already suspected. He was no longer my father. He continued to avoid mirrors. I started to notice that he also avoided our old family portrait, hanging in the living room. Whenever he passed by it, his gaze would avert, as if seeing that version of himself disturbed him in some way. I began to test my theory, moving mirrors around the house, placing them in strategic spots where he couldn't avoid them, but he always found a way not to look. I watched him constantly, my obsession growing. My friends, those few who still visited, began to notice my change. I had become withdrawn, restless. But how could I explain to them what was happening? How could I make them understand that something diabolical, something impossible, was living under the same roof as me? The nights turned into torment. The whispers I heard coming from my father's room were becoming more frequent, louder, and sometimes I even heard them during the day. They weren't mere words, they were something deeper, as if he were conversing with someone, or something, that wasn't there. One night, unable to bear my curiosity any longer, I decided to try to listen better. I left my room and crept down the hallway to my father's door. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, and for a moment, heard only silence. Then, as if he knew I was there, the murmurs began. At first it was a muffled sound, almost like a buzzing, but then, slowly, it began to clarify. I didn't recognize the language. The words were harsh, guttural, almost animalistic. A wave of dread washed over me, and for a moment I thought about going back to my room and pretending none of this was happening. But something kept me there, frozen. The sound grew louder, and I realized he wasn't alone. There was another voice there, a voice deeper, more resonant, like a distant echo, responding to his words. My heart began to race. Who was with him? I gathered all the courage I could muster and grasped the doorknob. I turned it slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door creaked slightly as I opened it a crack. The room was dark, but the moonlight streaming through the window illuminated enough for me to see. My father was standing in the center of the room, facing away from me. He wasn't talking to anyone visible. Around him, on the floor, there was something strange. A circle? No, something more complex, a series of symbols drawn with what looked like chalk or something similar. There was a pattern to them, something that made me uncomfortable just to look at. I tried to breathe silently while I continued to watch. My father remained still, his chin raised, as if he were waiting for something. Suddenly, he began to murmur again, this time with more intensity, the words sounding more threatening, almost like a command. I felt a chill run down my spine. I needed to get out of there, but as I tried to retreat, the door creaked slightly. He turned abruptly. His eyes met mine, but they were not my father's eyes. For a moment, I saw something I couldn't explain. A deep darkness, as if the man standing there was merely a thin veil covering something monstrous, something much older and more terrible. My body froze. He took a step toward me, his lips curling into a smile that didn't match his face. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice smooth but laden with something sinister. I managed to stammer an apology. I said I had heard a noise and was worried, but he just stared at me for a few more seconds before nodding. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice now more controlled. "Everything's fine." I ran back to my room, my heart pounding, trying to process what I had just seen. I couldn't sleep that night, my thoughts swirling around that circle, those symbols, that voice he had been listening to. What the hell was he doing? The next day, he acted as if nothing had happened. He seemed calm, even affectionate at times, which only made me more anxious. I tried to avoid eye contact with him during breakfast, but he seemed to watch me more closely. His presence in the room suffocated me. I could no longer ignore that something was deeply wrong. As I watched him from a distance, I began to search the house for more clues. There was something he was hiding, something I needed to understand. In his office, I found several old books, covered in dust, with titles I had never heard of before. They were written in languages I didn't recognize. There were notes in the margins, diagrams that vaguely resembled the symbols I had seen on the floor of his room the night before. I wondered how long he had been involved with this. Before he disappeared, he was an ordinary man, focused on work, finances, and family. And now, it was as if he had plunged into something darker, something that had changed him completely. My investigations began to consume me. I spent sleepless nights trying to decipher the notes he left around the house. Each discovery led me deeper into a labyrinth of madness. My obsession began to affect my relationship with my mother. She accused me of being paranoid, of seeing things where there was nothing. "He's your father," she said. "He's been through a lot. He just needs time." But I knew it was more than that. I began to feel like I was being watched, even when he wasn't around. Sometimes during the night, I heard whispers coming from different places in the house, not just his room. It was as if the entire house was embroiled in something evil, a force that lingered in the air and seeped into every corner. In one of those sleepless nights, I decided to follow my father. I waited for him to leave the house late at night, as he had been doing lately. I hid in the shadows and watched him walk toward the forest near our house. Something inside me screamed not to follow him, but I needed to know. I needed to understand what he was doing. The darkness in the woods was thick, and the moon barely illuminated the path. I moved silently, keeping a safe distance until he finally stopped in a small clearing. The scene I found froze me in place. In the center of the clearing stood a stone, covered in the same symbols I had seen before. My father stood before it, his back to me. He began to murmur again, the same strange language, his eyes fixed on the stone. Suddenly, the air around me felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere was changing. I watched, powerless, as the darkness in the clearing began to move, almost as if it were alive, writhing around my father. It was an impossible sight, but at the same time, terribly real. I tried to back away, but I stumbled over a dry branch. The sound echoed in the clearing, interrupting whatever was happening. My father turned quickly, his eyes meeting mine in the dark. I could feel the fury radiating from him, a fury that was more than just human anger. It felt as if I were about to be consumed by it. He began to walk toward me, and I, finally, did the only thing I could. I ran back home, my heart racing, my lungs burning. I didn't look back, but I knew he was behind me. I felt his presence closing in. I reached home and locked the door behind me, but the sound of his footsteps stopped abruptly. I waited, sweating, the silence suffocating me. He didn't come in. The next day, he was there, sitting at the breakfast table, smiling at me as if nothing had happened. I could barely believe what I had experienced the night before. Fear began to mix with an even more unsettling feeling, the fear that I was losing my sanity. But one thing was clear. I needed answers. That morning after the clearing, something inside me had changed. The fear I felt transformed into a kind of urgency, a need to understand what was happening before it was too late. I needed answers. My father was no longer the same. I was sure of it. Something had returned in his place, something dark and ancient. I was certain of this, but how could I prove it? I felt more isolated than ever. My mother, worried about my growing obsession, stopped trying to convince me that everything was fine. Now she simply avoided talking about it, as if it were easier to pretend nothing was happening. And who could blame her? It was easier to live in denial than to face the abyss opening before us. I spent days revisiting the symbols I had found in his room and remembered the old books I discovered in his office. I decided to go back there, now with the determination to uncover something that could help me. When I entered, I closed the door behind me and began to search everything again, more attentively this time. There was something hidden there, something I hadn't noticed before. After hours of flipping through old pages, my eyes fell upon a specific book. It was smaller than the others with a faded leather cover. Upon opening it, I noticed that many of the pages were handwritten in a script I didn't recognize at first. But as I continued reading, I realized it was my father's handwriting. The content, however, was disturbing. The first pages seemed to be random notes, almost like a diary. He talked about his life, about family, work. But as I progressed, the writing became increasingly incoherent, more fragmented. He spoke of strange dreams he was having, visions of unknown places, voices calling to him from within the shadows. The words grew more desperate with each page, until at one point he stopped referring to himself as I. He began to refer to him as if describing another person, or something that had taken control of him. I continued reading, a growing sense of discomfort washing over me. On one of the last pages, he mentioned an entity he had encountered in one of his dreams. The name was illegible, smudged by the haste with which he had written, but he described it as an ancient presence, a thing that existed before time, watching and waiting. There was a passage written right after the description of the entity that made me freeze. He found me, came to me while I slept, and offered me knowledge, power. I tried to resist, tried to push him away, but his voice was like poisoned honey. Now he is inside me. I see the world through his eyes, or perhaps he sees the world through mine. I no longer know where I end and he begins. The last pages were covered in scribbles and grotesque drawings, symbols that I recognized from the ones he drew on the ground during his strange ceremonies. My heart raced as I tried to process what I was reading. If those words were true, if my father had really made some kind of contact with an entity, then what had returned was no longer him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Every time I saw him, that dark presence seemed stronger, more tangible. There were moments when he caught me watching him, and his eyes would narrow, as if he knew what I was thinking, as if he knew I was trying to uncover his secrets. It was then that I realized there was a pattern to his movements. Every night he left the house at the same time, walking toward the forest. Each night he seemed to stay out longer, and when he returned, he was stranger, more distant. I knew I couldn't let him continue with this, but I needed more proof, something concrete. I decided to follow him again, but this time, I would bring a camera. I waited patiently until nightfall, adjusting the camera in my coat pocket. When he finally left, I followed him at a safe distance, taking care not to be seen. He took the same path as the previous night, heading toward the clearing. The cold wind cut against my face, and the forest felt darker than ever, as if it were suffocating all light around it. When he reached the clearing, I hid among the trees, watching him from afar. He began the ritual again, murmuring words in his guttural language as he drew more symbols on the ground. The shadows seemed to writhe around him, contorting in impossible ways, as if they were alive. I took out the camera and started filming, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the air around me grew thick, and the sound of whispers began to swell, as if it were coming from all directions. My ears buzzed, and the pressure in my head mounted, as if the very air were trying to crush me. I tried to focus on the camera, but then something happened. Something I would never be able to forget. The shadows around my father began to take shape, growing and expanding until they were impossibly tall. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. They closed in around him, surrounding him, and in that moment I saw something, a blurred figure, formed from the shadows, leaning over him as if whispering in his ear. My body froze. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but I was paralyzed by terror. The figure seemed to feed off my father's presence, and he looked almost entranced, as if he were accepting it. His eyes were glazed, his mouth murmuring incomprehensible words. The air around me seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. And then, something even worse happened. The shadowy figure turned toward me. For a brief moment, I felt its eyes, or whatever they were, boring into me. A deep, endless darkness, as if I were staring into the very void of the universe. My mind went blank, a scream trapped in my throat. I couldn't move a muscle. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching. By the time I regained control of my body, it was too late. The shadows dissipated, and my father stood there, looking directly at where I was hiding. But something had changed. His face looked different. Not physically, but there was something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Something cold, inhuman. He knew I had followed him, knew I had seen. I turned and ran. I ran back home, not looking back. My mind was in shambles, and each step felt like it took an eternity. When I got home, I locked the door behind me, breathless, trying to calm my racing heart. My thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear. The man who had returned was not my father, not anymore. After that night, I started to notice other things. He knew I was suspicious. His glances became sharper, more calculated, as if he were waiting for me to make a mistake. He continued to act normally in front of my mother, but with me, there was a constant tension in the air, as if we were trapped in a game of cat and mouse. I knew he was planning something, but I couldn't figure out what. The tension between us grew with each passing day, and I felt that something terrible was about to happen. My dreams were becoming more vivid, more terrifying. I dreamed of the shadow figure, its eyes fixed on me, whispering words I couldn't understand but that filled me with dread. I would wake up in the middle of the night, cold sweat covering my body, feeling as if it were there in the darkness of my room, watching me. There was no escaping anymore. I was trapped in that house, trapped with that being, and I knew the end was near. The game was just beginning. The days that followed my last venture into the woods were a blur of fear and despair. The tension between my father and me had reached an unbearable point. I could feel, at every moment, that something was about to happen. It was as if the air in our house was charged, ready to explode. He didn't say anything about having seen me that night, but his glances, those empty, calculating glances, followed me everywhere. It was a waiting game, but time was running out. My dreams were getting more vivid, tormenting. Every night, the shadow figure would come to me, not just watching me now, but whispering words that seemed to come from a place far beyond this world, promises of power, knowledge, and destruction. Each time I woke up, I became less certain of where the nightmares ended and reality began. The walls of my own sanity were crumbling, and I knew I needed to find a way out before it was too late. I started avoiding my father as much as possible. I would lock myself in my room, staying awake late into the night, waiting until I heard his footsteps retreating to his room before I would allow myself to close my eyes. Every little sound in the house made me jump, and every time I encountered him in the hallways, my skin would crawl. There was something deeply wrong with him, something that didn't belong in this world. Then one night, everything changed. It was late, probably after midnight, when I woke up abruptly. The air felt strange, heavy, almost suffocating. I instinctively knew something was wrong. There were no whispers this time, no sound, but the house was off. I got out of bed, feeling a wave of dread swell in my chest, and slowly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was shrouded in shadows, darker than usual. The moonlight barely penetrated the windows. I stepped into the hallway, moving silently, hardly breathing. As I approached my father's room, the feeling of unease intensified. The door was ajar, and there was a faint light coming from inside, as if something was softly glowing, but in an unnatural way. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Something inside me screamed to turn back, to run as far away from that house as possible, but I knew I could no longer flee. I pushed the door open, and what I saw froze me in place. My father was in the middle of the room, standing within a circle of symbols drawn on the floor with the same chalk I had seen before. He stood upright, facing away from me, but the most disturbing thing was the light. There was a strange luminescence emanating from the floor, from the symbols, pulsing as if it were alive. The shadows around the room seemed to dance, twisting in impossible ways, as if they were being drawn into the circle. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. He began to murmur again, those ancient guttural words I had heard so many times before. This time, however, the words were different, more powerful, as if he were summoning something. The air around me grew heavy, denser, and I felt like I could barely breathe. Finally, I managed to stammer a word. "Dad?" He turned slowly, and when his eyes met mine, I realized that the thing inside him was stronger than ever. There were no more traces of the man I once knew. His eyes were opaque, empty, as if an endless darkness inhabited behind them. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. He just looked at me, studying me, like a predator watches its prey before it strikes. I was overcome with a mix of panic and fury. I shouted, demanding answers, asking what he was, what he had done with my real father. He just watched me, impassive, without emotion. Then he raised a hand and pointed at me, without saying a word. It was then that I felt the presence. It was like a wave of darkness, an invisible force that completely enveloped me. My vision blurred, and I fell to my knees, struggling to breathe. My body trembled uncontrollably, as if it were being drained of energy. And then I heard it again. The whisper. But this time it was clearer, louder, as if it were right next to me. The figure in the shadows was there, in the room. I couldn't see it completely, but I could feel its presence, dense and oppressive, filling the entire space. My father, or whatever that thing was in communion with it. They were one, connected in ways I couldn't comprehend. But one thing was clear. That was not my father. That was something much older and more evil. Something that had infiltrated our reality through him. I fought to stand up, but my body felt like it was bound by invisible chains. My heart raced uncontrollably, fear consuming every logical thought I could muster. I knew I needed to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. But the darkness around me seemed to have a will of its own, trapping me, sucking away every shred of hope I still had. Then something strange happened. My father, or the entity controlling him, stopped murmuring. He lowered his hand, and for a brief moment, his eyes shone with a different light. A light that seemed human. He took a step toward me, and for an instant, I thought he might be coming back, that I might be reclaiming the man I knew. But then that light vanished, replaced by total emptiness, an abyss of darkness. With monumental effort, I managed to stand. My legs were weak, but I knew I had to get out of there. Without thinking twice, I ran down the hallway, descending the stairs as fast as my feet would allow. Behind me, I could hear my father's footsteps following me slowly. There was no urgency in him, as if he knew I had nowhere to run. I burst through the front door, the cold night air wrapping around me like a momentary relief. I ran into the forest, not looking back, my heart racing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing on the damp ground. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get as far away as possible from that house, from the entity that now inhabited my father's body. The branches of the trees scratched at my skin as I plunged deeper into the woods. Finally, exhausted, I stopped running and fell to my knees. It was dark, the moon just a thin sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the path back. My breath was heavy, and my legs trembled from the exertion. The silence around me was overwhelming. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. I heard the footsteps before I saw him. They were slow, heavy, as if something were moving carefully between the trees. My heart raced again, and my body stiffened with fear. I knew I couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere left to escape. I was trapped, surrounded by the darkness of the forest and the sinister presence that followed me. "Why are you running?" My father's voice sounded behind me, but it was different. There was something else in it, something that sent chills down my spine. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing among the trees, looking at me with that same empty gaze. The darkness around him seemed to move with him, as if it were an extension of his body. I knew that thing, that entity, was watching me through his eyes, studying me, waiting for the right moment. "I am your father," he said, the voice distorted, as if mixed with another, deeper, older voice. "Come home." But I knew he wasn't my father, not anymore. The last thing I remember is his eyes, empty and piercing, as the darkness around him advanced toward me, swallowing me whole. The world disappeared in a wave of shadows and whispers, and I felt like I was falling into an endless abyss, where time and space made no sense anymore. When I woke up, I was back home, lying in my room as if nothing had happened. But something inside me had changed. The house felt darker, more oppressive than ever, and my father was there, sitting at the kitchen table, with that same empty smile, as if nothing had occurred. I know he's waiting. I know that whatever is inside him is still watching me, still lurking, waiting for the right moment to make its next move. And I am trapped here, with no way out, no answers, just waiting, like him,